Hi there! Welcome to this class. In this lesson, we will be learning about poetry, and by the end of the lesson, you should be able to read a selection of poems, explain the meaning of selected poems, identify the language of poetry, and write simple poems of your own. Poetry has been in existence for almost 4,000 years. Poetry is a piece of literature written in calculated lines that are arranged in patterns of rhymes and stanzas or verses. Poems, which are the product of poetry, have patterns of sound, imagery, rhythm, and implied meanings. When poems ever show the feelings, many poems even show the feelings or the emotions of the poet. It is written in a condensed language and usually has a deep meaning. There are several types of poetry, and I bet you are already familiar with some or all of them. Let's take a look at 3 of the common types. 1. Epic poems. Epic poems are poems of extraordinary length that usually follow a hero's journey across the vast and mythological world. An example of an epic poem is the Aeneid, a 9,896-line poem written by Virgil between 29 and 19 BC, which tells the legendary story of Aeneas, a Trojan who traveled to Italy, where he became the ancestor of the Romans. Another type of poem is 2. Lyric poems. Lyric poems are poems that express the thought and feelings of the poet. They often use poetic devices such as imagery, metaphor, and rhyme to create an emotional response in the reader. Lyric poems can be about any subject, ranging from love and nature to politics and social issues. An example of a popular lyric poem is The Owl and Me by Andy Garvin, which reads, "An owl sitting on a tree is a wonderful sight to see, and I think it is cool if it lands on me. Sometimes I can feel it and sometimes not. The owl and me are both having thoughts." By Andy Garvin. From the poem, you can see that there are lots of lyrics and rhymes in it, as a tree rhymes with see and it rhymes with not. The language of poetry, being deep and concise, can also be seen here, as the owl might just be a poetic symbol for a quiet person to whom the writer can relate, and not necessarily the owl bird. The third type of poem we would learn about is 3. The dramatic poem. Dramatic poems are poems that tell a story and focus on a specific subject or idea. They often involve characters, plots, and a narrative structure. They are written with a particular focus on creating an emotional and dramatic effect. The language and imagery used can be intense and vivid, and the subject matter can often be quite dark and intense. Some common themes of dramatic poems include love, death, loss, tragedy, and redemption. An example of a popular dramatic poem is My Mother by Anne Taylor. Let's read 2 stanzas of it together. "Who sat and watched my infant head when sleeping on my cradle bed, and tears of sweet affection shared? My mother, when pain and sickness made me cry, who gazed upon my heavy eye, and wept for fear that I should die? My mother." From the poem, you can see that there are also rhymes in it, as head rhymes with bed and shed, while cry rhymes with eye and die. The language of this poetry can be seen to be emotional and intense, as it talks about the touching love of a mother for her child. Poems are fun, aren't they? Having learned about poems, some examples, and different poetic languages, do you think you can write a poem of your own? Well, let's try to write a poem together about our mothers. You love your mother, don't you? Well, let's come up with a poem about our mothers and see if we can put a lot of that love into it. An angel on earth flying to rescue me, a free ride to heaven, a heart bursting with compassion, blessed is she who gave me birth. There, we just wrote our own poem about mothers. Can you see that we described mothers as angels? However, they are not physically angels, are they? But poetry allows us to compare two things that makes us feel the same way. And since mothers protect us just like angels, we can say they are angels on earth. Also, did you notice the rhymes in our little poem? Earth rhymes with birth, me rhymes with she, and heaven rhymes with compassion. That makes our poem lyrical, don't you think? You may practice writing other poems about different things using the secret ingredients you have learned in this lesson. Practice does make perfect. And with that, we have come to the end of our lesson on poetry, where you have been taught what poetry and poems are, how to recognize the poetic language, and how to explain a poem and write one. See you in the next class.